Okay, and we're back. Thanks very much for sticking with us. We have, to wake up everybody in the room. Our next presenter, and is actually the final presentation for the 2013 Glenn Gerberg Weather and Climate Summit, is Jeff Lukas from University of Colorado. Jeff spends a lot of time looking at trees and trying to read the tree rings and determine water resources and how trees have been stressed and how they've grown quickly and all that sort of stuff. You can really put together a story of our climate and how things have been changing over the long term, as well as water resources. So yesterday, Sarah Maxwell and I had the pleasure of going with Jeff just across one of the slopes here at Breckenridge into the forest, where, by the way, I was jokingly asking Jeff if there were any bears still out, and he said he was talking to one of the folks at Breckenridge earlier in that day and said, you know, coincidentally, there is one bear, and it hasn't hibernated yet, and it's on our trail. So fortunately, we didn't see that bear, but we did get to experience how to core a tree the right way with permission from the Forest Service, and then start to read some of those rings. So I have a brief video. It's about 4 or 5 minutes long, but just shows the process that we went through yesterday, that Jeff went through, to core a tree. So let's take a look at that, and then we'll dive right into Jeff's presentation.
Jeff Lukas with the Western Water Assessment Program at the University of Colorado. And here at Breckenridge on a beautiful day during the Weather and Climate Summit to demonstrate tree coring technique. This is how dendrochronologists, tree ring scientists, get samples from living trees without harming them unduly and learning more about past climate. So this is the main tool of the trade. It's called an increment borer because we are going to bore into the tree to look at the growth increments or growth rings. This tool was developed by Swedish foresters over a century ago, and it's barely changed since. You've got a handle, you've got a hollow drill bit with very sharp threads and a cutting bit, and so as you turn it into the tree, it cuts out a core that's about a chopstick, 1/4 inch in diameter, or 1/6 of an inch. And then we've got an extractor or spoon to pull it out when we've gotten as far into the tree as we need to go. This is a lodgepole pine, and this tree is owned by the American public and managed by the U.S. Forest Service. We have permission to core a tree right next to the Breckenridge ski runs. This is not necessarily a tree we would want to core to get a climate record of either moisture or temperature. We're kind of in a middle zone where trees will probably respond to both moisture if it's a really dry year or temperature if it's a very cold summer. So really just to demonstrate the method, not because we would select this species on this site for any climate information it might have. So the trick is to find a nice crevice in the bark, line up your increment borer so it's pointing more or less towards the center of the tree, because the closer you can come to the center or pith of the tree, the more information, the more growth rings you'll be able to sample with your core. And then you want to keep it pretty steady as you're putting it into the tree so you don't have a corkscrew at the end of your core. And once you get a good bite. Once you get those threads to bite, the threads do the rest of the work. So as I'm turning the borer into the tree, it's cutting away this little cylindrical core. And of course, the further I go into the tree, the further back in time, because it's laying down the newest wood just underneath the bark, the oldest wood at the center. This tree, I would guess, is maybe 100 to 150 years old. We'll see if I can do a rough ring count and confirm that estimate.
So do you go all the way through to the end, to the other side?
We don't. That would be a nifty way to get 2 cores for one, but you really just have to go to the center of the tree. You'll get the same information on the other side. Now, if we were doing this for real and collecting what we call a full site chronology from a couple dozen trees, same species, same site, we would actually take 2 cores per tree, and that's so we can average out the within tree variability. You can see this tree is pretty straight, but it's got a lean here at the bottom. It's growing on a slight slope, and so the growth rings will tend to be adjusted from perfectly circular because of that. And so getting cores on opposite sides of the tree is useful, but typically we would do that by coring on one side and then coring on the other. So I'm just going to use my spoon to make sure I'm at least halfway into the tree. It looks like I am. So I now insert this spoon. It's got some grippy edges at the end. I'm going to meet some resistance as I am snugging it in. The core is already in there. Now at this point, the end of the core is still attached to the inside of the tree, and so now I back off the bore one full turn, so the core is still in the same orientation, but it should be broken away from the wood inside the tree. Pull it out. Here's our core. And it looks like, hard to tell how close we got to pith. Looks like we may have gotten very, very close. So let's take a close-up look. The lodgepole pine, like most pines, the rings can be seen very clearly. The ring is made up of the wider part, which actually in the sapwood out here appears darker, and then the narrower part is called the late wood, put on in the late season. Here in the rest, so the sapwood is more saturated with water. This is more sapwood. It's a little drier, so here we can see the early wood bands that are wider, and then the late wood band, which is darker and narrower. And so the combination of an early wood and a late wood is one annual ring. So it looks like we've got maybe 10, 20, 30, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. Yeah, I think we're looking at about 120, 130-year-old tree. Plus the time, we have to add in the time that it took the tree to grow up to the level at which I cored it. If I wanted a more accurate estimation of age, I could have cored it right at the base. Of course, we can't see the base underneath the snow. But that's basically how we would do it out in the field to get a record back into time of how climate has influenced the growth of this tree. This tree is only about 120, 130 years old. Typically, we would be working with trees in Colorado that are anywhere from 300 to over 1,000 years old. Douglas fir, pinyon pine, ponderosa pine, and bristlecone pine would be the oldest trees. All right, well, thank you for the introduction from yesterday to the methodology of tree ring science. And I'll start by thanking again Dave Jones and Sarah Maxwell and the rest of the staff at Storm Center. Before I begin, I want to say a little about the program that I'm with. Western Water Assessment at the University of Colorado is part of a NOAA network called RISA, Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments. And there are 11 university-based regional programs, and you can think of the RISAs as test beds for climate services. So helping NOAA figure out how to interface climate sciences with societal needs related to climate-sensitive decision-making, and provide climate science research, information, tools to help decision makers at the local and regional level, and show NOAA, basically prototyping for NOAA how to develop and deliver regional climate services. And this very crowded acknowledgement slide first indicates what an intensely collaborative science, tree ring science is. You have to work with a lot of people around the country if you're doing work on a large scale. A lot of people who are out in the field doing good work. I'll single out Connie Woodhouse, who has been my collaborator and mentor for about 15 years now. She's there in the upper right in her natural habitat, coring trees. Also need to mention Ed Cook from Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University. He was responsible for initiating a lot of the work that I'm going to show today. I'm not being modest. when I say that a lot of what I'm going to show in my presentation is the work of others, and I'm privileged to help interpret it and convey it to a larger audience. So today I want to start with talking about how tree rings record hydroclimatic variability, how they record drought, how we can tease those records of past climate and drought out of the rings. Then look at a handful of recent extreme drought events and see how they line up compared to a much longer paleo record from the tree rings. And then get into this concept of mega-droughts, these very extreme and persistent drought events, and then how drought risk might change in the future. So first, I want to reflect a bit on the nature of drought. Very simply, it's not having enough water to meet societal needs, whether it's water supply, filling a reservoir here, water for crops, water for natural ecosystems. And fundamentally, drought is driven by deficits in precipitation. So some period, weeks, months, years, in cases of below average precipitation. Drought is almost always exacerbated by higher than normal temperatures that accompany that below normal precipitation. And that's because, of course, the same synoptic patterns like blocking highs that lead to below normal precipitation also lead to heat, increased heating. It is not the case that you can get a drought from heat alone. It really starts with the synoptic patterns that produce lower precipitation. Heat, particularly in the warm season, is so closely associated with dry conditions. And they kind of go together. And of course, by increasing evaporation, transpiration from vegetation, the higher temperatures will exacerbate the impacts of the low precipitation itself, leading to impacts further down this chart: lower soil moisture, more plant stress, drier fuels, and on water supply, lower stream flows, and ultimately declining reservoir storage. So the three recent extreme droughts that I want to look at are the first in the Colorado River Basin, which we are in here. I want to look at the 2000s drought as a whole dry decade. Not every year was a drought year. It included two extreme years of drought, 2002 and this past year, 2012. In Texas, 2011 was an extremely dry year. Of course, dry conditions continued in 2012 in Texas, but I want to isolate 2011 as a one-year drought. And then, of course, this past year, I'll call it the U.S. Heartland, but involved most of the contiguous U.S. Drought conditions that emerged in the spring and peaked this past summer. And if you looked at the media over the last decade and the last couple years, you saw words like unprecedented, record, historic, attesting to some unique aspect or aspects of all three of these droughts. But when an event is unprecedented, it means that we have one occurrence in, say, a 100-year, if we're lucky, observed record. That actually gives us less information than we'd like and less information than we need to help understand the risk of that event and manage and plan for that risk in the future. We don't know, as in the case of this drought that occurred in 2002, this is looking at stream flows in the South Platte River, just on the other side of the Continental Divide from Breckenridge. We don't know if this is truly a novel event that did not ever occur before, could not have occurred before because of some changing boundary condition of the climate, or if it's just the expression of some underlying recurrent event at a 1 in 100 year interval, a 1 in 50 year interval, or maybe it's a 1 in 500 year event that we were unlucky enough to receive just in the last decade. So we don't know, given a 100-year record. So how can we get more context for these unprecedented or record or historic events? There's a whole branch of climate science called paleoclimatology, and you'll know if you've been at previous summits from Jim White's talks about ice coring and work in Greenland and Antarctica. There are many different natural proxies that rely on either biological or geochemical processes that somehow record and filter a climate signal and allow scientists to capture and sample those processes and interpret the data and look at past climate and get a much longer window onto past climate. There are a number of different natural climate proxies. I'm showing just a handful of the most important ones. And in the lower right, we have tree rings. And the science of tree rings is called dendrochronology. Well, tree rings have some important attributes. No one of these is unique to tree rings, but I think as a set, it makes them unique among the different paleoclimate proxies. We have annual resolution. Tree rings can be absolutely dated to the calendar year in nearly all cases. We have long and continuous records, typically between 200 and 1,000 years in a few places around the world, continuous records from the present back 10,000 years. We also have widespread distribution of climate-sensitive trees around the globe on every continent except Antarctica. And we have relatively straightforward translation of the information recorded in the trees into the climate variables that we're interested in. The methods that I'm going to talk about for the next little while are not at all new. Modern tree ring science really began in the early 1900s with A.E. Douglas at the University of Arizona, still one of the most prominent tree ring laboratories in the world. And then the science of dendroclimatology, using tree rings to study past climate, really kicked off with his student Edmund Schulman in the 30s and 40s. And really the methods and the principles that they developed and used are the same ones we use today. The advantages that we have now are many more practitioners of this science. We can cover a lot more ground, sample many more trees on all 6 continents. We have more sophisticated statistical analyses and then the computing power to use those. So, trees respond to many things in their environment, whether it's nutrients in the soil, whether it's light coming through the upper canopy, if it's a multi-storied forest. But generally, climate is the main factor limiting tree growth year in and year out. And I'm going to make a division here between kind of 2 very broad sets of trees, depending on where they're growing, both in elevation and in latitude. So at the highest elevations in latitude, so above where we're standing, up to the top of the mountain here at Breckenridge, and at high latitudes, so in the near Arctic, in, say, Canada and Alaska and in Siberia, trees will tend to be limited by energy availability, so the length and warmth of the growing season. Conversely, at lower elevations, really most of, say, the continental United States and mid-latitudes, trees tend to be more limited by available moisture. And so the rest of this talk, of course, will focus on those trees because those are the ones that will tell us what we'd like to know about drought. And of course, no matter where you are in the country and the world, moisture availability varies greatly from year to year. Precipitation processes, synoptic patterns vary a lot. Seasonally, they vary a lot year to year. Here's annual precipitation in this neck of the woods in western Colorado. Varies by over 2-fold from the wettest to driest years. And so you get resulting great variability in ring widths. And here in western Colorado and across most of the United States, dry conditions create a narrow ring, wet conditions create a wide ring. And the sensitivity with which the tree growth responds to those variations of precipitation does vary from region to region. It varies from species to species. Really where we are here in sort of the semi-arid interior west is one of the hot spots for getting this moisture signal. Which integrates both precipitation and evapotranspiration as it's sort of mediated in the soil. The bank of moisture that the tree draws from during the growing season, but that bank gets filled up not just by precipitation that falls in the growing season, but also in the 6 to 9 months or so prior to the growing season and stored for the growing season. So it really integrates not only both precip and evapotranspiration, but also over a more or less 1-year period. Yes? No.
not allowed to touch anything that has to do with switches. I'm good, thank you. Okay, we'll go stereo. Would the tree ring respond to that trauma?
Yes, so the full question was, can trees respond to individual traumatic meteorological events, like a hurricane that would defoliate most of the tree? And the answer is absolutely yes. When you have a defoliation, if you have, say in a flood, saturation of the root zone that prevents oxygen from getting to the roots for more than several weeks, you are going to see reduced growth. And that pattern, in many cases, well, you'll know from the site whether it's an area that is subject to hurricanes. You probably have historic records of defoliations. And so you can have some way to calibrate and then tease out that signal of traumatic events, as you say. But yes, there is actually a branch of dendrochronology called dendrotempestology. So reconstructing hurricanes and other severe windstorms and weather events from tree ring records. And question in back. Microphone for Matt.
Hi, I'm Kent Earhart. Has anybody, is it possible or is it interesting, has anybody developed any kind of a lightning climatology? And is that even possible?
It's very possible. I have not heard of such, but one could. In fact, I could develop one for my property up in the Front Range of Colorado, where since I've lived there the last 7 years, I've seen 4 trees actually get struck by lightning on my property. See the scars if I didn't see the strike itself. And those scars remain for many years, and like any scar that destroys the cambium, the living layer of the tree underneath the bark, you can come back and date that scar. It will interrupt the growth layer at that scar surface. So in principle, it could be done. I've not heard of anyone doing it.
So that becomes then noise in much like when you're taking snowfall measurements. You wouldn't core one tree per 100 square miles.
Exactly.
You'd do a sampling of trees, and any individual events would stand out in those.
That's right. Very perceptive. One person's signal in a lightning chronology would be a noise when you're trying to pull out a climate signal. So annual growth often very closely tracks annual moisture availability. And here I've cherry-picked a bit. This is one of the better trees at one of our better sites in western Colorado near Grand Junction. But I'm showing raw ring widths from one core, from one tree, pinyon pine, against annualized August through July, so a 12-month period, precipitation. And the correlation is about 0.8. So in the interior west specifically, but even across most of the continental U.S., there's very good raw material to work with. There's not a whole lot you have to do sort of post-processing to tease that signal out. The trees do a very good job of tracking year-to-year fluctuations in moisture. And because trees are tracking those fluctuations in moisture very well, and because trees at a given site will be experiencing more or less the same climate, we can use the resulting similar patterns from tree to tree to help absolutely cross-date each annual ring. So if we have 2 trees here that we record near Boulder, if one happened to have a missing ring because of either a traumatic event or it was just extremely dry that year, and it had a locally absent ring on the trunk where another tree had that ring, we compare those records from multiple trees, and so we can discern when we might have just a ring anomaly specific to one tree versus what is happening across the whole stand. And to show how close those patterns can match from tree to tree, this is about a 7-year segment from 2 different trees showing, so starting in 1921, 1922, 23, 24, very dry year in 1925, 26, 27, 28. I mean, it looks like these cores are from the same tree, but 2 different trees, but they're seeing the same climate. And since I used microring in the title of my talk, I felt obligated to show you one. I don't know if you can see it in the room on the screen. It is, so another about 7-year sequence here in southwestern Colorado We've got 1897, 1898, very dry year, abruptly dry year in 99, a little recovery in 1900, a little wetter in 1901, quite a bit drier in 1902, 1903 wetter again, and here's 1904, is just the width of this arrow. It's about 3 cells wide, 2 early wood cells and 1 late wood cell. This tree barely grew. It was focused on other things like regrowing the foliage that had lost and the fine roots that get lost every year. So diameter growth is not the highest priority, which is why it's so sensitive to moisture fluctuations year to year, and this would be an extreme example. And what I'm calling the moisture signal can serve as a proxy for several different moisture-related climate variables, because in most parts of the country and the world, these are very tightly intercorrelated. So annual or seasonal, like warm season or cool season precipitation, spring snow water equivalent, annual or water year stream flow, and drought indices like PDSI, Palmer Drought Severity Index, or standardized precipitation index. And we've got a question here, and yes? No. Okay, that we did. I've been talking about ring width as the chief proxy climate indicator in trees, and it is the one that's most widely used. It is not the only one. You can also use stable isotopes of carbon to look at moisture independent of the ring width. You can look at stable isotope of oxygen that reflects the temperature of the source water taken up by the tree. So kind of an independent measure we can compare with temperature estimates from temperature-sensitive tree ring width. And also the density of the late wood. Again, this dark band that's put on in the later part of the summer very closely reflects summer warmth in the energy-limited trees at high elevations and high latitudes. So tree ring science is more than ring width, but you can do an awful lot with ring width. And in my work, I've pretty much stayed just with that one measurement. So collecting these moisture-sensitive tree ring records in the field, as was alluded to earlier, one tree might give us a good, rough estimate of what's going on with the climate, but we wouldn't want to rely on it because a single tree could be responding to any of a number of other things in the environment that would vary independently of climate. And so we want to find a stand of old trees of the same species, mostly conifers, pines, Douglas firs, junipers. As we get into the California and the southern Midwest and the East, long-lived hardwoods like oaks tend to be as important or more important than the conifers because of their availability. They also have a very nice moisture signal. And then we'll collect cores, and you saw the coring demonstration earlier. This is what a core looks like. We'll collect those cores, and after they're mounted up, they look like that. From at least 15 to 30 or 40 trees, typically, again, 2 cores per tree, and then cross date, so establish absolute dates for each growth ring, and then measure using a computer-aided measuring device, measure to the nearest micron, so 1,000th of a millimeter, the width of the rings, and compile those rings into a site chronology. So here I'm showing several dozen individual, we call ring width series. So from individual cores on a time axis from the mid-1500s to present, and you can see they record pretty closely the same ups and downs. The very dry year in 2002, a lot of drought around 1840, and wet years right before. And then we use a robust averaging procedure to generate this one-time series of what we call ring width indices to represent the average standard or average tree response, which we presume to be closest to the climate response of that stand. And as an example, this is a site not far from here. It's just about 20 miles up Highway 9 from Silverthorne, right near the shores of Green Mountain Reservoir, but well above the reservoir, very dry, shaly slope. Douglas fir chronology.
So we had living trees here on the left going back around 700 years, which is a typical lifespan for a Douglas fir, and then very well preserved dead wood with the inner rings dating back to the 500s AD. So these are trees that might have died up to 1,000 years ago, and the sapwood, the bark in the outermost wood is gone, but the rest of it is intact, and the wood is, so this is a cross-section from a tree from that site. This tree lived about 800 years and died about 400 years ago. We've still got, probably 80%, 90% of the information intact and as readable as if we cored a living tree. And so this helps us extend the records much further back than if we only had living trees. And as long as there's overlap using cross-dating, we can match those similar ring width patterns during the overlap between the living and dead trees. And so for about 10 years, this is most of what I did. Go out in the field for not very much time in the summer, usually a week or two, collect a bunch of wood and bring it back to the lab and spend the rest of the year working it up. This is when I was at INSTAR, Institute for Arctic and Alpine Research at CU, the very institute that Jim White now directs. And we worked up about 100 different site chronologies, mostly in Colorado and in surrounding states. So you can imagine that if there are several dozen other tree ring labs around the country, we can collect a lot of great information about climate over a very spatially extensive area. I want to single out 3 chronologies in the lower left-hand corner of Colorado, so the southwestern part of Colorado near Durango, because this gets at something that is always both an interest and a concern when you're working in paleoclimatology, is we can take our proxy record, so ring width variability, and compare it to observed climate over the 100-year or so record where we have an overlap. But then we need to, we can only assume that that relationship has been stable over time. We can't directly, we can get some circumstantial evidence, we can look at other proxies and kind of triangulate from those, but we have to assume this principle of uniformitarianism, that the processes that operate today are the same ones operated in the past. And so it helps when I make plots like this. We have 3 separate chronologies, so 3 completely independent sets of trees over about a 50-mile arc in southwestern Colorado. So not responding to the exact same climate, but a very similar climate. And in fact, we see not just in the last 100 years, but the previous 2 centuries, they are tracking very nicely together. And this gives me increased confidence that the relationship between tree growth and climate has been stable over the previous centuries. So back to getting out in the field and collecting wood. So this is what happens when all of my colleagues from across the country and in Canada have been collecting over the last several decades, as we now have almost 2,000 different site chronologies of moisture-sensitive trees that we can then use to represent not only what's going on at a particular site, but spatial patterns of climate and drought, as I'll show soon. So to actually generate the reconstructions, to get from these individual site chronologies to what we call a tree reconstruction or estimate of past climate, we first need an observed record, and it needs to be at least 50 years long. So precipitation, stream flow, snowpack, if it needs to be corrected for inhomogeneities from station moves, or if it's a stream flow record on, say, the Colorado River where there's been a lot of depletions and dams and diversions, those need to be taken out because the trees don't know about them. Then we'll select some subset of tree ring chronologies, usually from 10 to 50 chronologies from more or less the surrounding region, that watershed, or within, say, a couple 100 miles, and find the best fit statistical relationship between the tree rings and observations during the overlap period. So find the trees that best fit the observed record and create a model, a statistical model, typically using a regression procedure, but there are many different ways to do that. And you end up with a tree ring reconstruction once you take the full length of the chronologies and run them through the model you've developed during the overlap period. Now, after Margaret's talk, I'm not sure I want to show confidence intervals, but I have to, because the trees are not rain gauges. The trees are not stream gauges. They are not perfect recorders and filters of the climate signal, of the moisture signal. There's always uncertainty in the reconstruction. We can look at the error distribution in the statistical models we generate, and we can make confidence intervals. I'm showing an 80% confidence interval with these gray bands. But that also does not capture uncertainties that arise from the different modeling choices that we make, how we process the tree ring data, whether we use a linear regression or a different type of regression. And so we just need to be aware during this talk that I'm going to show a single line to represent a tree ring record. Please imagine this gray band around everything I show. That's a tree ring reconstruction. For visual clarity, I don't have them in on most of my graphs, but imagine the gray band. It's always there, whether you know it or not, for any paleoclimate record. And really in the headwaters of the upper Colorado River Basin. The upper basin is in beige here. About 85% of the flow in the entire basin is generated in the upper basin and comes through Lees Ferry, Arizona. And if you look at what was unprecedented or historic about this drought in the Colorado River Basin, first of all, you had extremely low precipitation, both on annual time scales, though not a record in 2002 or 2012, but certainly as you get to longer time periods, 5-year, 10-year, 13-year, lowest observed precipitation over the upper Colorado Basin. And not surprisingly, you ended up with the lowest stream flows over those same time periods. So here is about 100 years of naturalized stream flow records at Lees Ferry, Arizona. So all of the water collecting in the upper Colorado Basin. And this water serves over 30 million residential customers from Denver all the way to Los Angeles and Tucson and Phoenix. It also supports some of the most valuable irrigated agriculture in California, Arizona, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah. 3 million acres of agriculture. So enormous economic output and livelihood depends on this water and its availability. And it's been a tough decade since about 2000, punctuated by 2002 and 2012. And so how do we get more context? We can calibrate a tree ring reconstruction. This is showing the fit of the tree ring model in blue and the observed record in gray. Our fit is really good. R squared of about 0.75. That is really at the upper end of what you'll see with tree rings. Much higher than that, you're probably overfitting the model. But this just shows how strong that moisture signal is in the trees in this region. And then here's our full reconstruction, going back to 762 AD. Again, like I showed with that Green Mountain Reservoir chronology, it's using both living and dead trees to get back that far. And so here we're looking at the annual flows, and keep your eyes on kind of this lower end, these low blue bars pointing down. So here's the reconstructed flow for 2002, which is very close to the observed flow at about 5 or 6 million acre feet. We go back in time, and we can still see about about 8 years that are lower or in that ballpark. So 2002 is in the lowest 10 reconstructed flows in this 1,200 plus year period. So you could look at it glass half full, glass empty. You could say, oh, it wasn't the worst. It's still within the bounds of natural variability as seen in the tree rings, but it was pretty darn close. Yes, exactly. The lowest one, yeah, it was in the lowest. The observation was that this 2002 was in the lowest 1% of all of the annual flows as reconstructed by the tree rings in the past 1,200 or so years. As we go to longer time scales, so here I'm averaging over a 10-year period, we start to see that the paleo-droughts emerge. And so I've taken the 2000 to 2009 mean observed flow, so again, the driest decade in the last 100 years, and plotted it. And we can see, again, a handful of events, these blue bars dipping down, that are clearly lower than the lowest observed decadal flows. And I've highlighted in yellow this period in the mid-1100s, where we see that the decadal flows, average flows, were below the long-term mean for about 60 years. And there's nothing like this in the rest of the record, except maybe a little further back. This is a very unusual event. There's certainly nothing like it past 1900. So the observed record on which we've based our planning and management of the Colorado River. In fact, we see during this period we have a very wet, almost unprecedented wet period, and another wet period, and a dry in between. We go to a 20-year running mean, this mid-1100s period sticks out even more. And here's where I'm going to attach this mega-drought label to it. This is not perfectly well defined in the literature, but generally it is used to refer to a persistently dry period at least 20 years long. And you really have to look back in the paleo records to see mega-droughts. They are few and far between globally in observed records. But you see them all over the place when you look back 1,000 years in western U.S., all over the world. These persistently dry periods of 2 to several decades or longer. This mid-1100s mega-drought, you had 46 years out of 57 that were below the mean annual flow, and very few dramatically wet years that you would need to refill, say, the big reservoirs on the main stem of the Colorado. So, unprecedented event in the context of the 1,200-year record, nothing that we've seen since 1900. And we've got a question in the back. Oh, Mike?
Did that coincide with the disappearance of the Anasazi in the Southwest?
That's actually, it coincides with the you could say the transition or the movement of one main component of Anasazi civilization. That was the Chacoan culture around Chaco Canyon in northeastern New Mexico. Occurred about the same time. There's a lot of argument still in the archaeological community about whether the drought was the trigger or a last straw. It certainly was involved given the extent of the drought. So it was about that time. And another question here, Ned.
My question is, there's definitely periodicity and some information you could glean from these sort of 20-year, 10-year averages. So it looks like we're on a down slope right now. I mean, is that information being used by water planners to kind of look ahead?
It likely, I would say in 5 or 10 years it will be. This is really the cutting edge of applied dendroclimatology, is teasing out through fairly sophisticated frequency analyses these periodicities, trying to tie them to what we know about long-term climate oscillations that we see, like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, and trying to develop, at least in a rough probabilistic sense, some predictive skill into the future. Not that next year is going to be dry, but we expect, given past oscillations, that, say, the next 20 years has a 60% chance of being drier than normal, that kind of information. We're not quite there yet. There's very new work in the Colorado River Basin and a few other places in the West where that's being done. So I think it'll be another, like I said, 5 or 10 years before it can be put into practice. But that's definitely where we need to go to make this information useful in a forward-looking sense, not just a backward-looking for context sense. And so as you can imagine, water managers, not just in the Colorado River Basin, but around the U.S., are using this kind of information to give them more context to the observed record, develop more realistic worst-case scenarios for drought, and to just generally help them assess and plan for drought risk. Most of my examples are from the interior West, but as more streamflow reconstructions are being done in the Southeast and the East, upper Midwest, we see more water entities at the local, state, and federal level using this information. And so here's just one example, which I think is really nice because this is taking that mid-1100s mega-drought, and the Bureau of Reclamation ran that reconstructed flow series through their planning model for the Upper Colorado River Basin. One of the outputs is what would the elevations of Lake Powell and Orange and Lake Mead, the main stem reservoirs, what would they look like as you tried to manage using current policies through that mega-drought. And you find in green you're keeping the level of Mead up so that Las Vegas doesn't suck air. So they can still take water out of Mead to supply their population, but then you're having to let Lake Powell go way down below its power pool, so you're not generating water from Powell for about 30 years during this mega drought. That would be a huge hit on the power grid in the Southwest. Not to mention, what you can't see here is all of the other customers who would necessarily be shorted in the upper and lower basin. So that would be a very difficult event to manage through. We've taken the streamflow reconstructions for the western U.S. And examples of applications, details on methodology, presentations from workshops, put it all in this TreeFlow web resource at treeflow.info. You get more information about reconstructions of streamflow specifically. And so I shift gears a bit and talk about really almost a world in itself, a network of, a gridded network of reconstructions of summer Palmer Drought Severity Index that has been developed over the last decade by Ed Cook at Columbia and his colleagues, using those hundreds of chronologies that have been developed by myself and many other tree ring scientists across the country and in Canada, and developed 286 point reconstructions on a 2.5-degree grid of summer PDSI, going back anywhere from about 800 years to 2,000 years, depending on the location. And so you not only have time series of drought going back in time for each point, but you can develop annual and multi-year maps of this information. So an incredible tool for looking at both the temporal and spatial variability of drought in North America. And so I'm going to use that network of reconstructions to look at first our next case study, the Texas drought of 2011. And what was unprecedented about that drought was the lowest 12-month precipitation from September 2010 to August 2011, and not surprisingly, the lowest summer Palmer Drought Severity Index in the summer of 2011, again, statewide. And you can see how that drought just really honed in on Texas and covered pretty much the entire state. In fact, in August of 2011, 9 of the 10 climate divisions had extreme drought, so below -4 on the PDSI scale. And then the 10th was merely between -3 and -4. So we're going to look at PDSI using the Cook et al. Data set. And so here in the upper right-hand corner, I'm taking those 13 grid points from the Cook et al. Network that are within Texas, averaging them together, comparing it to the average of the 10 climate divisions, summer PDSI. So we've got an observed record in gray of statewide Palmer Index, and the reconstructed in red, and you can see they match very nicely. The R-squared is about 0.68. You can see the trees actually kind of overrepresent the drought. Say it's too dry in 1925, which is this peak right here. Otherwise, do a pretty good job of hitting both the highs and the lows. So, and this is based, the tree ring reconstructions are based on about 100 different chronologies from Texas and surrounding states. When those are plugged back into the models, we have a record back to 1250 of annual summer Palmer Drought Severity Index. And I've plotted the 2012 observed, and you can see it intersects that underestimate of the trees for 1925, 1789. Again, if we imagine the gray band around the tree ring estimates, it might have hit a few other kinds. So definitely 2011 in Texas was in that lowest 1% or less for statewide, state average drought in Texas. So it was a one-year event. It was a very extreme event, even in the context of the paleo record. Again, as we look to longer-term drought conditions, we see things, well, first we do see the 1950s, which was a 7 to 10 year drought in most of Texas. That shows up pretty nicely as an extreme event. But then in terms of duration, we see events like here in the 1500s that don't have an analog in the 20th century. And this we call also a mega-drought, a late 1500s mega-drought. It's expressed not only in tree ring records in Texas, but around most of North America. It shifted around between 1560 and 1600, but most parts of North America experienced at least 20 years of very dry conditions during that period. And here we had 20 of 24 years with a negative statewide PDSI. So if you think of the impacts of 2012 and you imagine those, or 2011 and 2012, and extending out another 20 years, very difficult to manage water supplies, agriculture, and so forth. So finally, looking at the very dry conditions we've had over most of the country in the last year, with the peak in this past summer. Now, if you look at just the precipitation, we don't find a whole lot that was unprecedented about this drought. Wyoming and Nebraska had their lowest ever summer precipitation. That's about it in terms of statewide or larger area precipitation records. But what was really unusual about this drought was its spatial extensiveness of at least moderate drought conditions. And so we had the highest percent area of the contiguous U.S. in moderate or worse, so PDSI less than -2 since 1934. So not the high water mark in the observed record, but I think number 2 or number 3. The U.S. Drought Monitor showed it being the highest percent area in drought, but of course that record only goes back 13, 14 years. So it was a little unfortunate when that got picked up in the press as being unprecedented or record. When you have a 13-year period of record, you really don't want to draw many conclusions from that about the extremity of that event. But in any case, what was, of course, very unusual and most unusual and unprecedented about this past summer and this past year was the warmth. July, again, the warmest month ever in the contiguous U.S., and 2012, the warmest year. So, and here in July, last July, we had 60% more or less of the contiguous U.S. in moderate drought according to the PDSI scale. So how does that match up to past droughts at a continental or nationwide scale? And so again, we can use the Cook-et-al network, take all of the grid points within the 48 states, average them together, or actually in this case, look at the percent area, so the number of grid points reconstructed below -2 PDSI as a fraction of all of the grid points, and then compare that to the observed instrumental divisional PDSI, the fraction of the U.S. that was observed to be in drought. And we see those records, so observed in gray again, reconstructed in red, very, very close match in the highs and the lows, R-squared of 0.8. That was extraordinary when I plotted that. Some over-prediction by the trees of drought this is in 1977. Trees thought it was a little drier than the observed records, but otherwise a pretty nice match. So, and here's 2012, which again was not the highest observed. That was in 1934, but close to the top. So if we look at the full tree ring record, 1,000 years of reconstructed Palmer Drought Index, and here's that 2012 observed in the gray line at the top. We can see it hits, there's a few events just in this past century, and then a handful of events in previous centuries. But again, kind of few and far between. So definitely 2012 in that, lowest 1%. So stands out as a one-year event. Yes,
so,
Jim.
Jim White, University of Colorado. A question for you, Jeff. When you say the trees overestimated, so in a sense, we actually care more about what the trees have to say, because that's crops, that's vegetation, that's ecosystem. We depend on all that stuff. So would it be fair to say that what the trees think is just as important as what maybe something set on an inch scale of some precipitation bucket?
Yeah, I mean, Palmer Index, it's a funny index, and it represents both temperature or precipitation first and foremost, and also temperature, as both affect moisture balance, simulated moisture balance in a hypothetical soil column. So it was developed as an agricultural indicator. But you're right, trees are plants. They are also representing water balance as modulated by an organism, similar to the ones that we're trying to grow to create food. And so if the trees say it was actually a little drier in 1977 than the Palmer Index would suggest on a nationwide basis, the trees may be closer to some truth that we're interested in. So that's a good point. Yeah, question here.
You're right in St. Louis. Have you noted any kind of adaptability issues that perhaps after an in the midst of an extended drought, that perhaps a certain species learns to adapt and grow as it would under normal conditions in a drier condition?
It's a very good question, because trees they're organisms. They adapt. They can adapt not only from generation to generation, but as individuals to events in their lifetime. We really don't see, if we look at individual tree ring records from one tree, that sort of plasticity playing out in a way that would affect our interpretation of the past records. I mean, it's certainly possible in principle, but we really don't see it in practice. Yeah, absolutely. So again, as with these other cases, as we go to a longer time window, in this case a 20-year running mean, we see, so the same record as here, the annual values, here 20-year running mean, we see behavior in the past, extensive periods and persistent dry conditions that we don't see in the last 100 years. In fact, the last 100 years kind of stands out as being more on the wetter side. And here's that mid-1100s again. As it involved most of the western United States over several decades, and so that's going to push up your percent area of the 48 states in drought to the highest level in the past 1,000 years. So again, you look back further, you're going to see events, especially on longer time scales, you don't see in the last 100 years. So again, the kind of the take-home messages from looking at these three case studies in the context of the longer tree ring record, we see the one-year events of the past decade stack up pretty well. They're not only rare, unprecedented in the context of 100 years, they're pretty rare in the context of 1,000 years. These are pretty severe events. But longer recent droughts, whether in the Colorado River or elsewhere, tend to pale in comparison to the paleo-reconstructed extended droughts, including these mega-droughts I've showed you in the 1100s and the 1500s. And though I didn't focus so much on a century-by-century comparison when I've done that in this region and in other regions, the 20th century generally wetter than the previous centuries. So our baseline, our context for understanding and thinking about risk has actually been a little on the wet side compared to the previous 1,000 years. So since mega-droughts are these very eye-opening events and would be very difficult to manage through, let's take a little closer look at them. And so what conditions do we have in the climate system that cause them? Well, we know from looking at observed records back to the mid-1800s that when you have severe and extensive North American droughts, which have really been only up to a decade, they're strongly associated with La Nina-like conditions. So persistent cold pool, or cool pool at least, in the tropical Pacific, as I'm showing in this diagram. So this graphic shows mean conditions during the 1950s, very dry in the interior of the U.S., particularly the Southwest. So we had a cool tropical Pacific, particularly in the east, so very La Nina-like conditions over a decade, and also a warm North Atlantic, which has also been found to be strongly associated with persistent drought in North America. We've got limited direct paleo evidence from corals suggesting a cooler East Tropical Pacific during the whole so-called medieval climate anomaly from about 900 to 1400 AD, so the period in which that 1100s mega-drought occurred. There's other more circumstantial evidence from the periphery of the Pacific, again pointing to persistent La Nina-like conditions. and also for much of that time a warm North Atlantic as well. So the kinds of conditions that we see in the last 150 years as being a good setup for persistent drought. So it kind of fits together. What we also know is that this medieval climate anomaly was relatively warm globally and regionally. So if you look back before, say, the last 30 or 40 years, the last time that much of the U.S. and North America was this warm was during some or all of the medieval climate anomaly. And so the question is there an association, a cause and effect between the warmth and these persistent La Nina-like conditions? And there is, again, some limited evidence from climate modeling experiments that when you have increased warming and heating in the tropical Pacific, that somewhat paradoxically, you can get persistent La Nina-like conditions that would lead to droughts in North America. So kind of a tenuous association, but it seems to have held during at least some of the medieval climate anomaly. And when we look closer to that medieval climate anomaly, again using the Cook et al. Reconstructed PDSI network, we see not only this mid-1100s event in the middle, but another event in the early to mid-1000s, and then in the middle 1200s where we had 25 to 40-year periods where across the entire western U.S., over 80% of the years had negative PDSI, and including, looking again at the mid-1100s, 23 years in a row across the whole western U.S., so like west of the 100th meridian, where you had negative PDSI across the west every year. There's nothing like that in the last 150 years. We also, if we don't want to rely just on the tree ring width records, we have independent paleo evidence of medieval mega-droughts in specifically the western U.S., and some of the most compelling is flooded trees. It's just a little paradoxical, but these are trees that are still rooted at the bottom of lakes in the eastern Sierra, Lake Tahoe, Fallen Leaf Lake, Tenaya Lake, Mono Lake. And how did they get there? Well, it's nothing geophysical that occurred. The lake hasn't changed its position. The bottom is where it was 1,000 years ago. What happened was you had persistent low precipitation for a couple centuries at a time, 75% of normal on a 100-year average. And the lake levels dropped anywhere from 50 to 200 feet, depending on the lake, and allowed trees to establish and grow and live up to 200 years in places that are now 100 feet or more underwater. And these trees have been tree ring dated and in some cases radiocarbon dated to those same medieval intervals shown by the tree rings. We also have records of widespread dune activations in the Great Plains, such as the Nebraska sandhills. We see increased frequency of fire in tree ring records of fire scars from across the western U.S. And from sediment cores in Pacific Coast estuaries, we see that there was increased salinity, implying reduced inflows from coastal rivers emptying into the Pacific.
Just a comment. When you see the words dune activation, I don't think it conveys, sort of how startling that would be if today we had sand dunes in western Nebraska, where there are grasslands now.
Yeah, no,
that's what was
that's a great point. If you fly over the sandhills, you can see from 30,000 feet. They're obviously dunes, but they're green, and they're grays, and they're an important part of the economy and society of western Nebraska, and by extension the country. And there were periods where for hundreds, if not thousands of years, going further back in the Holocene, there was no vegetation, and they were shifting dunes. And this was one of those periods. So even if anthropogenic climate change were not occurring, if we had no knowledge or expectation of what was going to come in the future, given what we're seeing in the tree ring record, we would definitely want to prepare for droughts worse than any modern drought. And we have case studies, as I've showed you, from across the U.S. and across the world. And we can point to specific events. We can plan for them. And we could, estimate recurrence intervals of events of different severity and of different spatial extent. But we're entering this brave new world. Given the changing climate, what can we say about drought risk? And I'm showing some climate projections for Colorado. kind of a medium scenario, medium emission scenario, an ensemble of 16 GCMs, showing that, well, the observed record shows we've already warmed a degree or two since about 1970 in Colorado. 2012 was near the record warmest year. And then we expect to warm, according to the models, another about 3 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-century, and another 3 or 4 degrees by the end of the century. So what implications does that have? Well, first, if we think about the drought events we just looked at in the context of anthropogenic warming, which we know has been going on for several decades, really longer, but the biggest effect so far in the last several decades, it's very likely that the warming has worsened the impacts and indicators of these recent extreme U.S. droughts. Doing climate attribution or climate change attribution is generally a very involved modeling assessment. No one has yet looked at a specific drought event in the last decade and tried to, first of all, tease out the anthropogenic component of the warming that's occurred in that region, and then said, okay, what is that component? How has that specifically affected the drought impacts? But John Nielsen Gammon, the state climatologist in Texas, last year, stuck his neck out a little, did kind of a back of the envelope curve fitting, and came out with, in Texas, in 2011, approximately a degree to, or half a degree to a degree of additional anthropogenic heating above and beyond this relationship that we see in the blue diamonds that show the nice tight relationship between summer rainfall and summer temperature. So Texas was hot in 2011, first and foremost because it was dry, or because you had the synoptic conditions that lead to dryness, leading also to heat. But then there was this gap, this additional kind of over and above, and he's ascribing some of that to anthropogenic warming. So if we assume that, we know that that amount of warming is going to have a slight but still measurable effect on soil moisture. It's going to knock your Palmer Drought Severity Index down a few tenths of a point. It's going to decrease fuel moisture by a few percent. It's also going to reduce your stream flows by anywhere from 2 to 10%, depending on the characteristics of the basin. So I think we can see that all of the recent events have had a little extra impact because of the anthropogenic warming that we've already had. And as this warming is expected to accelerate in the future, and we've only seen the very kind of beginning of it, we expect the warming effects on drought and the indicators of drought to only get worse as we go into the 21st century. And so here I've taken that observed flow record of Colorado River flows from the 20th century and basically said, what if this occurred, reoccurred over the next 100 years, but with the expected, the modeled warming layered on top of it. And the effects on evapotranspiration is going to drive stream flow down at a reasonably well-known percentage. 10% by mid-century, annual flows would decline, 20 to 30% by the end of the century. And these are very substantial amounts, even that 10%. So that's 1.5 million acre feet that would be lost to just the warming component by mid-century. Denver takes 100,000 acre feet off of the Colorado River every year to serve about 500,000 people. LA takes a little over 500,000 acre feet a year to serve about 20% of its service area, a couple million people. Las Vegas takes about 250,000 acre feet. So in your 1.5 million, if that were cutting off, that could be cutting off Denver, Las Vegas, LA, Phoenix, Tucson. Now, obviously, in the real world, we would probably dry up agriculture first, but that's high-value agriculture, a lot of it. That's still going to be a huge hit for economy and society if flows on the Colorado River were to follow this trajectory from warming alone. We also expect precipitation patterns to change, though we know that the model projections of precipitation are not as robust as those for temperature. We still see this large-scale pattern emerging again and again and Jennifer alluded to this yesterday, of generally wetter to the north. So the wetter areas getting yet wetter, the drier areas, so the southern tier of the U.S., getting drier in the sense of getting less precipitation as the subtropical highs expand northward. But this is a very broad pattern, and what we're not able to get from the climate models in a consistent manner that we can reliably use is sort of the finer details, particularly what's going to go on in the tropical Pacific, which, as I've described earlier, is really the driver of, it's El Nino, southern oscillation, and at longer time scales, driving persistent drought in North America. And so if you look across the last generation of climate models, I don't know if the ones that are coming out for the upcoming AR5 report will look much different. I suspect not. There's not great consensus about how the mean state of the tropical Pacific will change in the next century, whether we'll see more El Nino, more La Nina, whether the amplitudes will be greater or lesser. And so basically whether the precursors or the drivers of persistent drought, if not mega-drought, will shift in a warming climate. We know circulation patterns will change as we're adding energy to the Earth system. What's not clear is how, and in particular, the circulation patterns that most impact drought in the U.S. And so we're kind of left with this tease at the bottom of, is that medieval climate anomaly, which we know is a warmer period, we know is a droughtier period in the U.S. and North America, is that an analog for the warmer future? Will the warmer future also be a much drier future in terms of lower precipitation? We don't know that yet. That's something we really need to get a better handle on. What we can say is that climate change, we go back to this flow chart, is going to affect drought at least through higher temperatures, this red arrow. And it's going to increase evapotranspiration, and regardless of what precipitation does, will tend to create dry conditions and drought more often, absent some huge increase in precipitation, which in most areas is not going to happen. What we're less sure about, again, is how climate change is going to alter the modes of natural climate variability and potentially cause more frequent precipitation deficits related to conditions in, say, the tropical Pacific and the North Atlantic. So to recap, I hope I have convinced you that tree rings robustly capture past drought and hydroclimatic variability in a way that we can extract and use those records for planning. If we look at extreme droughts in the last 10 years in the context of those longer records, we see they're still within the bounds of that paleo variability, but they're in the very lowest tier of those events, even in the context of the last 1,000 years. But in that last 1,000 years, we also see these persistent mega-droughts, such as the mid-1100s, that have no modern analog, would be very difficult to get our infrastructure, our systems, our society, our economy through. And the future, just from warming alone, is going to bring generally increased drought risk for the U.S., if not mega-drought risk, depending on what happens mostly in the tropical Pacific. And I took a lot of the resources that I've showed, websites and papers, and put links to them on this page that's on the Western Water Assessment website. So you can just record that website, wwa.colorado.edu/events/WX Summit. I forgot the C, so WX Summit. And you'll get links to most of the material that I showed today. And I thank you for your attention and be happy to take questions. And yes, I'm waiting for microphone.
Hi, Craig Setzer from CBS in Miami. So even absent of, it looks like, anthropogenic climate change, we still are on probably the higher part of a wet 20th century, and the chance, you would think, just based on the record, is towards drought, which we should prepare for regardless of what the future holds, yes?
Right. And this is something that the climate skeptics can agree on. And in fact, the climate skeptics tend to really eat up the paleo-drought studies. When I Google my own papers, and the first page of Google hits is almost always one or more climate skeptic and contrarian sites celebrating this new study that says, the recent droughts are unprecedented. Of course, the therefore that they have makes no logical sense. They say, therefore, we don't have to worry about climate change, or it's not occurring, or Al Gore is wrong. Well, maybe Al Gore is wrong, but we still need to worry about climate change. That's not the point of these studies. The point is, regardless of what we think the future will bring, we know that the climate system can dish out the events that we see in the last 1,000 years of the tree ring record. And we should expect that they have some potential to recur. And we should plan and manage for those. And a question back.
Matt Safino, Portland. Couple questions for you. I know this is going to be elevation dependent, latitude dependent, but ballpark elevation, where do you transition from trees being more hydrosensitive to being more energy dependent on their growth? And then also, where on earth do you find those 10,000-year-old tree rings?
Right. So the first question, where is that transition zone, say at elevation, between moisture-limited and energy-limited trees? It's actually pretty high up. So in Colorado, we've gotten very moisture-sensitive chronologies up to about 8,000 or 8,500 feet. In fact, we've got a site just out of Dillon, a tree ring site. It's right behind the cemetery in Dillon, so just a little higher than town, but it's on a dry south-facing slope that has, unusually for this area, both Douglas fir and ponderosa pine. So we can get good records up to 8,500 feet. From there to maybe 10,500 would be your transition zone, or mixed climate, or mixed temperature and moisture signal. And if I were trying to get a nice temperature signal, I would want to hit Engelmann spruce, bristlecone pine, limber pine right near tree line. So between 11,000 and 11,500 feet. So it's really that very upper tier of elevation. I presume that to be true in the other western states. I can't speak to the east. And your second question, I'm sorry, was? Yes, the 10,000-year-old tree rings, right. Because the oldest living trees on Earth are Great Basin bristlecone pines in California and Nevada, up to 5,000 years old. Okay, so that's one place you can find a 10,000-year record, as you get the 5,000-year-old living trees and then find enough dead wood, and you can have dead wood that's been lying on the ground for 6,000 or 7,000 years. These very dry sites, they have no soil, so it's just basically sitting on the rocks, very slowly eroding for thousands of years. And so they've been able to assemble a continuous record from bristlecone rings through the entire Holocene. Another location is somewhat unusually, or maybe counterintuitively, in Germany, German oaks. The living oaks only go back several hundred years, but when dead oaks, if they fall into a marsh or bog environment that is anoxic, so no oxygen, no bacteria, decay organisms, they can sit there preserved in that mud for thousands of years. And so using much shorter segments in Germany, they've been able to piece together a 10,000-year record. And also in Ireland, using oaks, using bog oaks, they've been able to go back about that far. And Jim.
Jim White, University of Colorado. First, just to comment on that last point, the swamps of southern U.S. also have a lot of really old trees that fall down in the mud there.
Yep.
It's also full of gators.
Yeah.
Just lots of gators. I wanted to just make a point and an observation that we in the United States use pretty much all of the available fresh water we have, available surface water. It's used and put back in the river and reused. And so the fact that the 20th century has been wet, and that's the century we've industrialized and developed, is actually, there's a bit of insidious, badness there, because that means we have, built our infrastructure around an anomalously high amount of water. And we did that not only in the West, which you know very much about, we've also done that in the East. And even if we just go back to a natural or a time average level of moisture availability in the continental U.S., we would still be in some trouble.
No, that's a great point. Even if there were no mega-droughts, if the drought occurrences of the last 100 years were the ones that always occurred, but there was a lower mean state in the future, just because of things returning to kind of a natural variability, or regressing to the mean, you might say, we'd be in trouble, especially in oversubscribed systems, which many are, like the Colorado River, where we depend on getting at least that average of 15 million acre feet. If it goes down to 14.5 over a several decade period, that's a big problem. Yeah.
Any other questions from anyone? What? No, not while we're streaming. Yes, I do. Can you hear me okay now? Okay, thanks very much. I appreciate it, Jeff. Okay, I have one announcement for our online viewers. Remember, it's going to be just the same as yesterday and the day before. Jeff, Lukas, and Margaret Davidson will be back this afternoon at 1:30 Mountain Time to answer questions directly from you, the internet audience. And so get those questions ready. We had certainly a lot of comments earlier on about Margaret's presentation. When is it going to be up so they can point everybody to it? When is the video going to be up? So we'll look forward to that. And until then, we'll sign off now and show you just a little bit of the agenda for the rest of the day. And then we'll see you come back at 1:30 this afternoon. So thanks very much for joining us, and we'll see you back here later on this afternoon.